continue discussions on practical measures to facilitate trade and investment flows through the increased use of local currencies. This is a matter we believe that further discussions need to take place, particularly amongst our finance ministers.
Zero Reuters and BBC reports. Chinese, Russian, and Iranian warships have arrived at South Africa's Simonstown naval base near Cape Town for the multinational exercise Will for Peace 2026. The week-long drills, running until January 16th and led by China, involve vessels from BRICS plus nations, including destroyer CNS Tangshan, China, corvette RFS Stoichi, Russia, and expeditionary base Iris Makran, Iran. South African officials described the exercises as focused on maritime safety,
drill hosted by South Africa. Named Will for Peace 2026, the drill brings together key nations from the BRICS Plus group. Russian ships are also expected to reach Cape Town. China will lead the week-long naval exercise starting Friday. South Africa's Department of Defense said the drill will showcase the participants' commitment to safeguard maritime trade routes and deepen cooperation in support of peaceful maritime security. But the initiative also risks
naval exercises involving BRICS countries in South African waters. 2 Chinese naval ships as well as an Iranian vessel were seen arriving in Cape Town. These drills will start on Friday and run until the 16th of January. The exercise would involve navies from BRICS countries, including that of Russia. BRICS, originally made up of Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa, has expanded to include Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates.
We cannot contain China. Or let me put it more drastically. China has nuclear weapons, Russia has nuclear weapons, and one of the consequences of the United States' effort to fight China economically and to fight Russia in Ukraine has to bring those 2 countries closer together than they have ever been. It's too late, and we have too little in the way of means of doing it. We could have this Cold War, this economic war, degenerate into a military war. But then it's over for all of us and, game over. So what's the option? 2 things and then I'm done. 1, sit down with the Chinese and work out a way to live together on this planet, being careful of the natural environment and being careful of one another. We ought to be able to do that. We have more than enough brains in either of the 2 sides, and certainly the 2 together should be a stunning team.
If a country tells me, sir, we like you very much, but we're going to no longer adhere to being in the reserve currency. We're not going to salute the dollar anymore. I'll say, that's okay. And you're going to pay a 100% tariff on everything you sell into the United States. And we love your product. I hope you sell a lot of it into the United States, but you're going to pay 100% tariff. He will then follow it up by saying, sir, it would be an honor to stay with the reserve currency. That will be like just playing. That's not even chess, that's checkers. But you don't have listen to this, you don't have other people that can talk that way.
For much of the modern financial era, the dominance of the U.S. dollar was treated as an unshakable fact of global life. It underpinned trade, shaped debt markets, and gave Washington extraordinary leverage over international finance. From energy contracts to food imports, from foreign aid to sovereign borrowing, the dollar was the default language of global exchange. But beneath the surface of this apparent stability, pressures had been building for years. What once seemed unthinkable is now unfolding in real time. A slow but decisive shift in which Africa and the BRICS bloc are playing a central role in challenging the dollar's supremacy. This transformation did not begin with a dramatic announcement or a single coordinated decision. It emerged gradually, driven by frustration, necessity, and changing global realities. Many African economies experienced firsthand how dollar dependence translated into vulnerability. When interest rates rose in the United States, borrowing costs surged across Africa. When global crises hit, dollar shortages tightened liquidity, forcing governments to cut spending or take on more debt. Inflation often followed, eroding purchasing power and deepening social pressure. Over time, policymakers began to see dollar dominance not just as a convenience, but as a structural constraint. The BRICS bloc offered an alternative framework, originally formed as an economic grouping. It evolved into a platform for questioning the architecture of global finance itself. Its members shared a common grievance, a system that concentrated power in Western institutions while leaving emerging economies exposed to decisions they did not control. Africa, though not a formal part of the original bloc, increasingly aligned with its vision. The continent's trade relationships with BRICS countries expanded rapidly, particularly in energy, minerals, agriculture, and infrastructure. As trade volumes grew, the logic of settling transactions exclusively in dollars became harder to justify. Why convert local currencies into dollars only to convert them again into another partner's currency? Why absorb exchange rate risk that benefited intermediaries more than producers? Bilateral agreements began to emerge, allowing trade to be settled in local currencies or alternative units of account. Central banks quietly adjusted reserve compositions, adding non-dollar assets to reduce exposure. One of the most significant drivers of this shift was commodities. Africa is a major supplier of resources essential to the global economy, from oil and gas to metals and agricultural products. Historically, these commodities were priced and traded almost entirely in dollars, reinforcing demand for the currency. But as BRICS economies became major buyers, new pricing discussions opened. Contracts denominated in alternative currencies reduced transaction costs and aligned trade flows more closely with actual economic relationships. Infrastructure financing accelerated the trend. Large-scale projects across Africa increasingly relied on funding from BRICS-linked institutions and partners. These deals often featured repayment terms in currencies other than the dollar, insulating borrowers from dollar volatility for African governments struggling with debt burdens. This offered a practical solution rather than an ideological statement. Financial diversification became a survival strategy. The psychological impact of these changes was profound. For decades, the dollar's dominance shaped how policymakers thought about economic credibility. Holding dollar reserves was seen as a badge of seriousness. Conducting trade outside the dollar system was viewed as risky or unconventional, as Africa and BRICS countries gained confidence. Those assumptions began to erode. Financial sovereignty became a legitimate policy goal rather than a rhetorical slogan. Washington's response was initially muted. The dollar remained strong, supported by deep capital markets and global confidence. Early signs of diversification were dismissed as marginal or symbolic. But as the trend widened and deepened, concern grew. It became clear that the issue was not one country or one deal, but a structural reorientation. Africa's participation made the shift particularly significant because of the continent's scale and growth potential. Africa's population is young, expanding, and increasingly urban. Its markets are among the fastest growing in the world. Decisions made today will shape global demand patterns for decades. When African economies choose to diversify currencies and payment systems, they influence not just regional trade, but global financial flows. This reality has not been lost on financial institutions or policymakers. The narrative of dethroning the dollar often suggests a sudden collapse, but the reality is more complex. The dollar is not disappearing, nor is it being replaced overnight. Instead, its monopoly is being diluted. The world is moving toward a multipolar financial system where multiple currencies coexist, each reflecting underlying trade and production networks. In such a system, no single country enjoys unchecked monetary privilege. This shift has strategic implications. Dollar dominance has long allowed Washington to impose sanctions, restrict access to financial networks, and influence global behavior without deploying military force. As alternatives expand, that leverage weakens. Countries targeted by sanctions find new channels for trade and finance. Neutral states gain greater freedom to pursue independent policies. Africa's engagement with these alternatives reflects a desire to reduce exposure to external pressure. Technology has played a crucial role in enabling this transition. Digital payment systems, cross-border settlement platforms, and regional financial infrastructure have lowered barriers to using non-dollar currencies. African institutions are increasingly investing in systems that facilitate local and regional trade without routing payments through distant financial centers. These innovations make diversification not only possible but efficient. The political symbolism of Africa aligning with BRICS-led initiatives has also mattered. It signals dissatisfaction with the post-war financial order and a willingness to imagine alternatives. For many African leaders, this alignment is framed not as opposition to the West, but as an assertion of choice, engaging with multiple partners. Currencies and institutions reduces dependency and increases negotiating power. Critics argue that replacing dollar dependence with reliance on BRICS currencies could introduce new risks. They point to concerns about convertibility, transparency, and market depth. These concerns are real, and African policymakers are acutely aware of them. This is why diversification, rather than substitution, has become the guiding principle. The goal is not to abandon the dollar entirely, but to ensure it is no longer the sole pillar of financial stability. The impact on global markets is already visible in subtle ways. Reserve compositions are shifting incrementally. Trade settlement data shows a growing share of transactions conducted outside the dollar. Financial discourse increasingly acknowledges the possibility of long-term change. While none of these trends alone is decisive together, they point toward a structural transition. Washington's surprise lies partly in timing and partly in agency. The expectation was that any serious challenge to the dollar would originate from rival great powers alone. The active participation of African economies complicates that narrative. It shows that the shift is driven not just by geopolitical rivalry, but by widespread dissatisfaction with the existing system. Africa's role also challenges stereotypes about passivity in global affairs. By engaging strategically with BRICS initiatives, African states demonstrate an ability to shape global outcomes rather than simply react to them. This agency is exercised through policy choices that prioritize long-term resilience over short-term approval. The consequences for development are potentially significant. Reduced exposure to dollar volatility can stabilize budgets and protect social spending. More flexible financing options can support infrastructure and industrialization. Over time, these benefits could strengthen economic foundations and reduce vulnerability to external shocks. However, success is not guaranteed. Managing a more complex financial landscape requires institutional capacity, transparency, and coordination. Regional cooperation will be essential to avoid fragmentation and ensure that diversification enhances stability. Africa's experience will test whether emerging economies can collectively shape a more balanced financial order. The broader lesson of this moment is that global systems endure only as long as they are perceived as fair and functional. When large segments of the world feel disadvantaged, alternatives emerge. The dollar's dominance was built on trust, liquidity, and power. As trust becomes more distributed and power more diffuse, the system adapts. In this context, Africa and BRICS are not destroying the dollar so much as redefining its role. The currency will remain central to global finance, but it will no longer be unrivaled. This adjustment may be uncomfortable for those accustomed to unchallenged dominance, but it reflects the realities of a changing world. The future of global finance will likely be characterized by coexistence rather than conquest. Multiple currencies, payment systems, and institutions will interact in a more pluralistic order. Africa's engagement with BRICS-led alternatives positions it at the heart of this transition. What Washington did not fully anticipate was the speed with which sentiment could change once viable alternatives appeared. The combination of economic pressure, technological innovation, and political will prove powerful. Africa's role underscores that the shift is not confined to rival blocs, but reflects a broader rethinking of how global finance should work. In the end, the story is not simply about currencies. It is about power, choice, and the evolution of a global system built for a different era. Africa and BRICS are not dismantling the dollar through confrontation, but through participation in a new reality where no single currency defines the rules. That reality is still taking shape. But its direction is increasingly clear. As this shift accelerates, the most striking change is not technical but psychological. For decades, policymakers across Africa were trained formally and informally to think of the dollar as inevitable. Economic models, development advice, and international agreements were all built around that assumption. Once alternatives began to function at scale, the sense of inevitability cracked. What followed was not rebellion, but reassessment. Countries began asking whether loyalty to a single financial system still made sense in a world that had clearly become multipolar. This reassessment has reshaped how African governments view risk. In the past, risk was defined as stepping outside the dollar system. Today, risk is increasingly seen in staying trapped within it. Dollar shortages, sanctions, spillovers, and sudden capital flight have taught hard lessons. Diversifying currencies and partners is now understood as a form of insurance, not defiance. The partnership with BRICS economies provides a framework where that insurance can be structured collectively rather than individually. One of the most consequential outcomes has been the reconfiguration of bargaining power. When African countries negotiate trade, loans, or infrastructure projects with multiple currency options on the table, the terms change. Interest rates, repayment schedules, and conditionalities become more flexible. This has already altered conversations around debt sustainability, giving African economies more room to breathe and plan beyond short-term crisis management. The impact also extends to regional integration. African financial institutions are increasingly aligned with the goal of settling more trade within the continent using local or regional mechanisms, while linking outward to BRICS systems rather than routing everything through Western hubs. This layered approach strengthens internal markets while maintaining global connectivity. It reflects a growing maturity in economic strategy, one that balances openness with autonomy. Washington's discomfort stems less from immediate financial loss and more from long-term trajectory. Dollar dominance has never been only about economics. It has been a pillar of global influence. As Africa and BRICS reduce exclusive reliance on the dollar, that pillar weakens incrementally. Sanctions lose some of their reach. Policy signals travel with less force. Influence must increasingly be earned through partnership rather than assumed through position. This does not mean Africa is turning its back on the United States or Europe. Trade, investment, and cooperation continue. What has changed is the nature of engagement. Africa is no longer approaching the global system from a position of dependency, but from one of negotiation. The ability to choose currencies, partners, and platforms fundamentally alters the relationship. There are also cultural and political dimensions to this shift. The narrative of economic inferiority that long accompanied African participation in global finance is slowly fading. As African economies assert themselves within BRICS-aligned frameworks, they challenge outdated assumptions about where financial innovation and leadership can come from. This rebalancing of confidence is as important as any technical reform. Still, challenges remain. Currency diversification introduces complexity. Exchange rate management becomes more demanding. Regulatory coordination across borders requires trust and competence. Not all African economies are equally prepared for this transition, and missteps could create instability if not carefully managed. Recognizing this, many governments are moving cautiously, emphasizing gradualism over spectacle. The role of BRICS in this process is evolving as well. The bloc itself is not monolithic, and its internal dynamics are complex. Yet its significance lies in offering a platform where alternatives to Western-dominated institutions can be tested and refined. Africa's engagement ensures that these alternatives are not confined to one region but reflect broader global realities. From a historical perspective, this moment echoes earlier transitions in global finance. Monetary systems change when economic power shifts and when old arrangements no longer serve emerging needs. The rise of the dollar itself followed such a pattern. Today's transition is slower and more diffuse, but no less consequential. In conclusion, Africa and BRICS are not staging a dramatic overthrow of the US dollar. They are participating in a structural evolution that reduces its exclusivity and reshapes its role. Washington's surprise lies in the realization that this evolution is being driven not just by rivals, but by partners who have quietly decided. That resilience requires choice. Africa's role in this transformation underscores a broader truth. Global finance is no longer the preserve of a single center. As economic gravity shifts, so too does monetary influence. The dollar will remain powerful, but it will share space in a more plural system shaped by emerging economies that refuse to be passive. The outcome of this transition is not predetermined. It will depend on policy discipline, institutional strength, and cooperation across regions. But the direction is unmistakable. A world once organized around one financial axis is giving way to a more balanced order. In that order, Africa is not waiting for permission, it is helping to write the rules.